Today we're going to talk about natural selection. You will need to take notes on what we're going to be talking about today. So if you don't have your notebook out, go ahead and grab it. You can pause the video to write down the title. Otherwise, I'm going to continue on. Our goal for today is to describe the 4 requirements for natural selection. We also need to be able to describe the differences between Darwin and Lamarck's theory of evolution. You'll see I just added that in there. Those are our 2 goals for today. Don't worry about writing this down. I'm going to give you some background here that's kind of important. So the 17 and 1800s, scientists began discovering fossils. They started asking, well, why do these fossils of these ancient organisms, why do they look different from today's organisms? And so they began to think that organisms changed over time. So in order to talk about evolution, we first have to talk about what evolution is. Evolution is change over time. Feel free to write this down. So scientists in the 1800s, they had come to the conclusion that organisms change over time. Some of them did. Some people were very against this idea, and there were a lot of individuals who were very religious who thought that God made animals and they made them in perfect form and they would never need to change. And so they had a hard time wrestling with this concept. So along came some scientists, and some scientists decided to investigate this. One of those scientists was John Baptiste Lamarck. Go ahead and write this guy down. You don't need to know his middle name. You don't need to know his when he was born or when he lived. The reason I put that down there is so you have an idea of when all of this happened. So this wasn't in the 1900s, and this wasn't way back in the 1500s. So this guy, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he proposed the idea that organisms gained features they used a lot and then lost features they didn't use. So, for example, let's say somebody is in a wheelchair, even though they don't have wheelchairs back in the 1800s, or maybe they had crude versions. Let's say somebody was in a wheelchair, okay? Because they didn't use their legs, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed, oh, well, they just, the next offspring they have wouldn't have as long of legs, or would pass on no legs to their offspring. Now we think that's a little bit of an absurd idea because we know how evolution works. But back then they were just trying to figure out how things worked. So his classic example here is of giraffes. So he is hypothesizing that giraffes a long time ago had short necks. And over time, they kept stretching their necks to reach leaves higher and higher up. And as they stretched their necks got a little longer, and then they passed on their stretched necks to their offspring. We know now that just because I want to be a really good basketball player and I stretch my arms up to the net, it's not going to make me grow taller, and it's not going to make my kids grow taller. But back then, that's what they thought. So along comes Charles Darwin. He is another scientist, and you learned about him a little bit in the 7th grade. He took a journey on a ship, and he was like, hey, I'm going to go study the natural world. He was called a naturalist, studying the natural world, kind of like an environmentalist or a biologist, what we would call today. So he jumped on this ship, and he sailed for a long time all around the world. So this ship was called the Hms Beagle. It's kind of a replica of what it looked like. And take a look at the world map here. This is from 1820. This is today. I know they're a little bit different, but you can tell there are some things like this kind of looks smushed compared to this, right? So in Australia here, I know it's kind of copied on both sides, but you can see it's not quite the same shape as here. So while they knew kind of roughly what the world looked like, still wasn't mapped out super well. So Darwin goes on this whole trip. He starts from England. He goes to South America, around South America, Australia, South Africa, back to South America, and then back to England. Any guesses how long this took him? So this trip took Darwin 5 years. Can you imagine living on a boat for 5 years? And they don't have a lot of the tools that we have nowadays. Even just food. They didn't really know how to preserve food very well. So a lot of people who would be on these big, long ship trips would end up getting sick and malnourished. So along the way, Darwin brings his notebook and he jots down all of the different animals he sees, and he also takes specimens back to him. So he's got a boat full of like tagged animals, rodents, insects that are dead that he's going to bring back to England and say, hey, look at what I found around the rest of the world. So can you imagine, right? Your boat, not only is it full of food that's probably getting insect infested, you got all these dead animals on your boat with you, right? Quite the journey. So one of the things Darwin's most famous for is he visited the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos Islands are off the coast of South America, and it's a set of these different islands, and he looked at a lot of different things on these islands, but the one thing that stood out to him were the birds on these different islands. And when he went to these different islands, he saw that different islands had similar looking birds, but slightly different. So I want you to take a second and tell me, how are these birds similar? Just pick one thing. Maybe you said they all have eyes, they all have beaks, they have a similar head shape. Okay? So they're similar. Now tell me, how are they different? So you probably told me about their beak shape or their head size. And so what Darwin saw is that the birds were similar, but they were also different. And as he observed them and watched them, imagine him just like sitting in the bushes for hours, recording notes with his notebook. That's what he did. He saw that they ate different foods on different islands. So this large ground finch would eat seeds, and it had a beak that was kind of bigger for cracking seeds. And the vegetarian finch had a smaller beak. And the woodpecker finch, its beak was long and skinny because it was trying to peck and get the insects inside of the tree. So Darwin, from all of these observations, he found and he wrote a book. And in this book, he describes a theory he has about evolution. So remember, scientists kind of figured out organisms changed, but they didn't really know how. And that's what Lamarck, he was like, oh, well, they must, change because they use things a lot. Darwin had a different idea. Go ahead and write this down again. You don't need to know when he lived. His theory is called the theory of natural selection. And again, we're trying to describe how organisms change over time, how and why. So he said that organisms that are best adapted to their environment survive and reproduce, passing on their genes. Take a second and pause this if you would like to continue writing it down. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. Next up, Darwin laid out 4 requirements for natural selection, or 4 kind of things that have to happen. So go ahead and write these down. He had 4 requirements for natural selection. The first one is variation. There had to be variation in organisms, meaning individuals had to be different. If individuals were all the same, then they wouldn't have differential survival, meaning some of them wouldn't survive and some of them would survive because of their traits. If they're all the same, they're all going to have an equal chance of surviving. The second requirement is overproduction. Typically, more offspring are produced then end up surviving. And this is true a lot. We see animals that have like litters, like of, let's say like a wolf has a litter of baby wolves, and, probably only a handful of them are going to survive. So this is very true. More offspring are produced than survive. And as a result, because there's so many, some of them struggle. The runt of the litter might not get enough milk, or might not be strong enough to survive on its own. Or maybe the big, strong organism is able to survive better than the smaller, weaker one. So there's a struggle to survive because they're either competing for resources, or some of them are better at hiding than others. And then over time, the population changes because those that are best adapted end up surviving and reproducing. And those that didn't have good adaptations for their environment died off. So we look at our example on the right here. There's variation in our beetles. Some are orange, some are green. Overproduction, there's more produced than can survive. Some of them are going to struggle to survive. The birds can easily pick out the green ones for whatever reason. They like the green ones. They can see them better. So the orange ones are going to be able to survive, while the green ones are going to struggle because maybe they can't blend in as well. Over time, the population is going to change because there's going to be more orange and fewer green. All right, some things to remember here. Individuals don't evolve. I know we use the word like evolve a lot, like, oh, I've evolved, okay, like in a human sense. Animals don't evolve, okay? This green beetle, no matter how much he wants, cannot will himself to change his color to orange. Doesn't work like that. So just because he wants to change color or wants to be different does not mean he's going to be able to, all right? So individuals don't evolve. What happens is that over time, the group of beetles is going to change so that there's more orange or more green and less of the other color. Other thing to remember, traits you develop during your lifetime, they're not going to be passed to your offspring. So for example, if I'm a bodybuilder and I have kids, my kids are not going to pop out of me being bodybuilders. Okay, so just because I built all my muscles does not mean that I'm going to pass that on to my kids. Or just because I learned to speak Spanish does not mean that my baby's going to pop out and know how to speak Spanish. Now, if I continue speaking Spanish, they're obviously going to pick it up. But just because I know Spanish doesn't mean my baby's going to automatically know how to speak Spanish the second they get into this world. So that's natural selection. Okay, we've got Darwin and Lamarck, and we got 4 different requirements for natural selection.